I'm Ruth Katz, Executive Director of the Health Medicine Society program here at the Aspen Institute. And I want to thank you, of course, for being here today for what I think is a very, very special session of our Public Health Grand Round series. We've got lots of good stuff to get to, and we will in just a moment. But before we jump in, I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about this event. Many of you know, I'm sure, that Grand Rounds is a time-honored feature of medicine designed to keep clinicians up to date about scientific and medical advances and to promote excellence in research and practice. In creating this series, we have borrowed from that tradition to advance knowledge about the cutting edge issues in health and public health, those important issues of the day. And I know that you will agree that none is more important, none is more critical than what you're going to hear about this afternoon. This is the fourth year that we are hosting Public Health Grand Rounds, and we couldn't be more excited to kick off this year's program with today's speaker, Michael Lubell, and you're going to hear a little bit more about Michael in just a moment. One technical note I want to point out, today's program is being live streamed and recorded, and the recording will be available on our website within 24 hours, probably even less than that. Now, as I mentioned, today's program is really quite special. And that's true not only because of Michael and his new book that you're going to hear about, but also because today celebrates the official launch of a new initiative at Health Medicine Society, the new Science and Society program. And its work, again, I think you would agree, could not be more timely or more essential, and I know promises to be most impactful. Let me then introduce to you Aaron Mertz, who is the director of our Science and Society program, to say a few words about it. By way of background, Aaron is a physicist by training, a Rhodes Scholar, and he comes to us from Rockefeller University, their loss, our gain. We're delighted to have Aaron on the Health Medicine Society team, and I know we look forward to doing great things together. Aaron?
Thank you, Ruth, for that introduction, and welcome everyone here in person in Washington, D.C., and also online on the live stream. My name is Aaron Mertz. I am director of the Science and Society program, which was established to elevate the status and role of science in our nation and our world through a variety of research formats, convening formats, outreach, and polling. As Ruth mentioned, this is the launch of our program, and because we're brand new, we would welcome your comments and suggestions. There's a card on each chair today with our contact information, so please send us any ideas you have and opportunities for collaboration. All inquiries and questions and comments will be read and responded to, so please send us your thoughts. I also wish to acknowledge support from our founding sponsors, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and Johnson & Johnson. We are joined today by Seema Kumar, who is Vice President of Innovation, Global Health and Science Policy at Johnson & Johnson, and she will say a few remarks.
Thanks, Aaron, and good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see such a big turnout and such a wonderful crowd here. I'm Seema Kumar, and I'm a champion of science, and I'm a lover of science, and I work for Johnson & Johnson, and you may be thinking, Johnson & Johnson and science, oxymoron? What does Johnson & Johnson have to do with science? Well, everything we have to do at J&J, from Band-Aids to baby shampoo, all the way to the latest cures that we're working on for cancer, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, immunology, and all of that has to do with science. And without science, we would not be able to solve some of the biggest healthcare challenges that we face. And Johnson & Johnson, as the largest healthcare company in the world, has a responsibility and the privilege of leveraging science to really make its benefits reap for society. Now, today, though, science has a big reputation problem and an image problem. We as a society seem to have a love-hate relationship with science. On the one hand, we love it because we are in awe and in wonder of things like space and things like technology. But on the other hand, it also seems to evoke fear, as in the case of GMOs and humanized robots and so on. And so I think at the end of the day, what people don't realize is that science impacts our daily lives in so many different ways, from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep. And yet science is shrouded in mystery. people still don't understand how it relates to their day-to-day lives. I'm not talking about those of us who are gathered here, because really I think we are to some degree maybe preaching to the choir. People still think of science as something that happens in the lab out there somewhere, typically done by a white man in a lab coat wearing safety glasses. And second, science is very complex. It's full of charts and graphs. It's impenetrable, inaccessible to those who are not from the science world. And there has to be somebody in the middle who translates it. There's a science haves and science have-nots in this world. Science is not inclusive. It is a very exclusive culture, and it hasn't opened up its arms and its minds to welcome people who are not from the ivory tower. So, that's another problem we have. And then finally, science is very, very rational. And it appeals to the brain. It's very cerebral and may not always seem to appeal to the hearts and minds of people who are not from the science world. So no wonder people have fallen out of love with science. And we're here today because we want people to fall in love with science all over again. And that is why we're so really thrilled to be partnering with the Aspen Institute and PBS to take science and make it relevant, simple, human, and use storytelling as a way to engage people and make them fall in love with science again. And that's why we're also here to congratulate Michael on his new book, Navigating the Maze, because it is a maze for those who are not from its world. And again, using storytelling as a way to chronicle the history of science and the benefits it has brought to society and the need for policy and for engaging the public. So again, thrilled to be here, thrilled to be a champion of science, and thrilled on behalf of Johnson & Johnson to be partnering with you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Seema. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce someone who, for most of you, needs no introduction, Elliot Gerson, who is Aspen's Executive Vice President for Policy and Public Programs and International Partners, and I have to say, a great champion of this new work and of health medicine society in general. Elliot will introduce our speaker and then take things from there. We promise you all that we're going to save time at the end for your questions, so let's get into it. Elliot, Michael, thanks very much, and thank you all again for being here.
Nicole. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Seema. Your remarks, I think we should put them on our website about why we are doing this project. We're really thrilled with Johnson & Johnson's support. I am very excited about the launch of this program and very, very excited about this book. Let me just say that this new program would not exist without Michael Lubell, whose vision it was, and who came to share it with me. I don't now remember exactly how many months ago. And Michael devoted enormous time and energy to establishing this program. And it was remarkable because I knew at the same time he was working on a book. And I must say now, after I've had the privilege of reading this book, it's frankly even more remarkable because I had no idea, frankly, that it would be, even though science policy is a big topic, that it would be this big a book in ambition and scope. And I think you all have Michael's biography, and I want to jump into a conversation as quickly as possible and leave time, as Ruth said, for questions at the end. But suffice it to say that he has been a leading scholar and physicist at a level of national and international prominence, and at the same time rose to comparably high position and impact in the world of science policy. And it's not common that one combines those things in a single career. One of his specialties that I take particularly interest in is quantum chaos, which is perhaps the most apt background one can have for life in Washington public policy these days. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about quantum chaos. I said, Michael, that this is a big book, and don't let its diminutive size or appearance fool you. Once you get into it, you will see just how substantial it is in many ways. But as far as the scope and impact, I think I can do no better than read just one short paragraph in the preface by Norm Augustine, where he concludes that Michael Lubell has provided a remarkably insightful and extraordinarily well-written treatise tying together policy and science. From the time of the Founding Fathers to the age of genomics, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. It is a book that should be read by anyone with an interest in science and technology, or public policy, or both, and especially by those with an interest in neither, but whose lives are being profoundly affected by both. And again, that harkens to Seema's really incredibly apt comments at the beginning. So let me just jump in if I can, Michael. So you're enjoying a distinguished career in physics and higher education. What in the world led you to turn to science policy?
Elliot, it's a wonderful question, and brings back memories of someone who is no longer alive. I was on the faculty at Yale, very happily teaching physics. My department chair was somebody some of you may recognize, Alan Bromley. And I got a phone call one morning, and it was in the spring, and it went something like this. Lubell Bromley here, that's the way he always spoke. And he said, you're going to teach energy and public policy in the fall. And I said, Alan, I don't know anything about that. And he said, don't worry, by the time the course is done, you will. So that was my real introduction to science policy. I'd also been heavily involved in politics, and we shared one campaign
in Connecticut.
Joe Lieberman, when he ran for the Senate, I wrote his defense policy for him. And so this was always something, it was an avocation. It was a way for me to engage with the public in a way that scientists don't when they're in their own laboratories. And I found it very rewarding, and one thing led to another, and I decided that would be another branch of my career.
Well, let me just jump in on something you just mentioned, your involvement in politics, and it relates to something I thought I might have gotten to later, but let me do it right now. Most scientists, my impression, living among many scientific friends, really wash their hands of politics, and they want nothing to do with politics. Is that itself a problem?
Yes. Let me say a couple of things about that, Elliot. First of all, scientists are very used to living in a world where there are facts, and they guide what we do. I mean, those of you who are scientists here know that fully well. You don't say, well, I believe something, and go off and do it. There are a lot of politicians who act on their beliefs, not necessarily founded in facts, some more so than others. I think we can agree with that. And so for many scientists, getting their hands dirty with politics, or getting involved in politics, is getting their hands dirty. And they find it anathema. What I always tell people, if you haven't been involved in politics, it may not be the facts, but there are rules. And those rules are really important. Now, they've been broken by this president that we have right now, but for the most part, politicians function in a world in which rules guide what they do. And in some sense, that's not too different from the way we work in science. The rules in science are different, but they're rules.
So now to the book. The book, Navigating the Maze, has a subtitle, as you've seen, How Science and Technology Policies Shape America and the World. Again, a bold title. But when you read the book, you'll see that there are extensive excursions here into critical issues that the public really may not see as science issues, but in fact you demonstrate quite clearly are. Some perhaps a little bit more obviously, whether it has to do with the GPS system on our phone or aspects of the internet, but also, as you point out, banking, finance, communications, education, virtually everything when you consider how science and technology has touched our lives. So just tell us why you decided, you told us why you went into science policy. Why did you decide to take all the time to write a book like this and with that subtitle?
Okay. I was approached by a couple of publishers and said that more and more students are interested in science and technology policy. And there is no text that they could identify. And they said, would I be willing to take this thing on? And I said, well, let me think about it. So I wrote a couple of chapters and a book outline, the sort of thing that you do with any book. And I chose one of the publishers, and that's how this started. But there's also another interesting piece of this. As I began writing, so I had the first two chapters. They are essentially as you will find them in the book. Then I got into a third chapter, which was supposed to be fairly brief, called Historical Perspective. And I discovered as I was writing that a lot of the things that I assumed, and almost everybody I knew in the policy world assumed, a lot of them were myths. And so I started digging through, doing the research into this, and discovered, in fact, that it wasn't just the beginning where we have myths, but all the way through. The constructs, the things that we've developed in our minds are very much associated with what we hear from other people. But when you go back and you look to see what actually happened, it's quite different. So that was one of the motivations for doing this thing. The second is that I happened to speak to Walter Isaacson when I was writing this, and Walter...
Which we were happy to facilitate.
Yes, that exactly. And Walter said something to me that I took that was very significant. He said, if you're writing a book, don't give facts, tell stories. And he said, people don't remember facts, they remember stories. And so, as a result, I started writing this thing as stories. I went back to the publisher, and I said, by the way, what I promised, I don't think I can deliver on. It's going to be different. The other feature is that science and technology policy is very complex. And to try to just describe what it is difficult in itself, but will also put everybody to sleep. And I said to myself, rather than trying to do that, let me just tell stories that illustrate how things work. And so that was actually how this developed.
And I'm going to have you tell a few of those stories, but this is not a book that's going to put anybody to sleep, I can tell you that. What you didn't plan to do ends up being maybe half of the book. I mean, really a history of science policy in the United States, and many reminders here. I mean, I'm probably not the only lawyer in the room who doesn't remember from law school or otherwise that science policy is in the Constitution. And Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution talks about promoting the progress of science. I mean, it's not a clause that gets quite as much attention as the Equal Protection Clause or others, but it's there. And similarly, we tend to forget that at least two, a number of our early presidents, obviously Thomas Jefferson, but also other key founding figures, were themselves scientists of global distinction, Benjamin Franklin, for example. And this book really does begin with the Constitutional Convention, with George Washington's engagement in science. So did you find that this historical perspective, which is so much of the book, really led you to change how you saw many of the other things that you'd already written or thought about in terms of science policy?
I hadn't written them yet. I had thought about them. But people ask, if you write a book, how do you go about it? Do you write a full outline and then just fill in the blanks as you go along? Some people do. I don't. And so I started telling stories, and I let them lead me on a journey. And so the book, although it's a historical narrative, there are also flashbacks and jumping forward to things to see. It shows you how all of these things developed, and it developed in my mind the same way. It's not just the way it's portrayed in the book. This was actually what was going through my mind as I was writing it.
So I mentioned stories. So let's just start with some stories, or a couple of stories. Tell us how the Smithsonian and the National Academy of Sciences, as just random examples, came to be.
I'll make it very brief. James Smithson, after whom the Smithsonian is named, was a British scientist, chemist by training, and he'd never been to the United States. And for reasons that nobody could quite understand, he decided he wanted to bequeath his estate to this new country, and that was in the 1830s. Initially, the money went to his nephew with a stipulation that when he died, when it was only 6 years later, that money be given to the United States. And Congress wound up with the grand sum, which was appreciable at the time, 105,000 pounds, with a stipulation that it should be used for an institution that would disseminate science to the public. Congress couldn't figure out what to do. And they dithered and dithered and dithered. Finally, it was between 7, 8, 9 years later, they conceived of this thing we now call the Smithsonian Institution. There was one problem. What do you put in it? So now you've got Smithson's bequest, but what goes into it? There's another story that intersects with this. John Sims, who was not a scientist, but he was a great devotee of Edmund Halley, whom some of you may know from the Halley Comet. What you might not know is that Halley was also a bit of a crackpot. He believed that the Earth was hollow, made up of concentric spherical shells. And of course, he was much derided by his scientific colleagues, but not by John Sims, which is several centuries later. Sims actually not only bought into Halley's concept, but he also developed another one, that you could get to the hollow Earth through tunnels at the North and South Poles. What do? So he was very well connected politically, relative to William Henry Harrison, and he spent time lobbying Congress. And finally, Congress appropriated this huge sum of money for a 4-year expedition known as the Wilkes Expedition. Scientific BS, as our current president would say. And they went off for 4 years. Of course, they never got to either pole. And if they had, they wouldn't have found the tunnels. But they came back with a treasure trove of scientific artifacts. That formed the very beginning of the Smithsonian collection. And there's a long story about the conflicts of who wanted what. So that's one. National Academy of Sciences is another one. Most people believe that Abraham Lincoln decided that science was so important that he would create the National Academy of Sciences. Well, he did sign the legislation, which passed Congress, by the way, in the wee hours of the morning, without debate. But there was a 12-year period prior to that that involved a group called the Scientific Lazzaroni, which I say reminds me of a Dan Brown novel. And they had the idea, they were basically, they looked at their scientific colleagues in France and in England and said, well, if they have a major academy, we need one too. And they tried like hell to get this done. And they were not making much progress. The Cambridge people were fighting the Washington people. Finally, Abraham Lincoln is president, the Civil War starts. They go to Lincoln and said, we can help you in the war. And he said, oh. And so legislation passes. He signs the bill. That's the beginning of the academy. The only problem is they couldn't help him. If you look at the historical record, they contribute absolutely nothing. And so they got the institution, the war ends, and now the thing is essentially broke. It was finally bailed out when Joseph Henry, who was heading the Smithsonian at the time, probably the preeminent American physicist, Henry bequeathed his estate to the national academies, and that's how it survived.
Well, you're giving us fascinating sort of biographical profiles here too. Let's move on to two leading scientific agencies and stories and biographies and the role of key individuals here. And the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation.
Yeah, those are, if you talk to the people in the public, they probably recognize both of those names to some degree if they know anything about federal agencies and science. NIH is the one that certainly Mary knows this very well. That's one that people will recognize. If they delve into science a little bit more, they'll know the National Science Foundation. The rest of the stuff, they don't know. And believe me, I mean, we all know there are other federal agencies that are just as important.
Alphabet soup to most people.
So how did these things come about? I'm going to get to the NIH second, but let me start with the NSF. Most people, many of you who are at Washington denizens and know something about this, we usually attribute the National Science Foundation to somebody by the name of Vannevar Bush, who was an engineer who ran all of the R&D during the Second World War, a confidant of Franklin Roosevelt. And he was so close to Roosevelt that he felt that he could write himself a letter from Roosevelt to him, asking him for what the post-World War II science ought to be like in the United States. And he did that. It's a monograph called Science, the Endless Frontier. And in that, he identified an agency which is now known as the National Science Foundation. What most people don't know is that Bush was at loggerheads with somebody by the name of Charlie Kilgore, senator from West Virginia, who incidentally defeated Rush Holt's father in a Democratic primary in the late 1930s. Kilgore had a great distrust of Bush. Bush was MIT, Bush was Eastern establishment. Kilgore was West Virginia. He'd gone to the University of West Virginia. And he didn't trust any of these elites. You know, you can think about today, same sort of thing going on. And, but Bush had Roosevelt's ear. Roosevelt dies. Now, the other interesting thing, Harry Truman becomes president. When Harley Kilgore joined the Senate, he became a member of the Military Affairs Committee. Who chaired that committee? Harry Truman. Truman did not know Bush. Roosevelt had kept Truman in the dark about almost everything. But Truman knew Harley Kilgore very well. So now Kilgore holds all the high cards. And he blocked Vannevar Bush's idea for 5 years. Truman actually vetoed legislation. And the final NSF that we know today was as much of Harley Kilgore's creation as Vannevar Bush. NIH. That gets into a lengthy history about disease in the United States. The Mississippi River Valley yellow fever epidemic in the 1870s. And then much later on, the influenza pandemic. These were all very important issues for helping the United States to develop its public health, which Ruth knows very, very well. But there's an interesting piece of this that very often gets left out, and that's the name Joseph Kenyon, and I think Mary probably knows that name. Joseph Kenyon came from a family initially in North Carolina, and then they moved to Missouri. His father had actually studied medicine, and he decided to follow in his father's footsteps. And he went to New York, studied medicine, went back home, decided that was not the life he wanted to lead. So he went back to New York, and this is in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And he landed a position in a brand new field which later became known as microbiology. He was given one room in the attic of the hygienic laboratory on Staten Island. And that's where he began his research. And by 1901, he had made the case, others had made the case, that there should be an expanded area of research. The hygienic laboratory moved to Washington, what is now Independence Avenue. And he now had more than just a single room in an attic. He had a whole floor. That was really the beginning of the major research initiative, which in 1930 became known as the National Institute of Health. And at that time, it was one institute.
And in here, you don't only talk about federal institutions. You spend a good bit of time talking about the Bell Labs, for example. Why do you do that, and why did it have such enormous impact?
Bell Laboratories was probably the pinnacle of industrial research. It was in an era when it was not only Bell, but IBM was a major player. You had Xerox PARC, General Electric. They were known as vertically integrated technology industries. But Bell was unique. Bell had this sweetheart deal, and I don't have time to go into how it happened, but the deal was this. They were limited in how much of a reach they could have in the United States, only 85%. That's known as a monopoly. But they were regulated. They could not charge what they wanted. They also, and so the government would basically say, you tell us what your costs are, and we will tell you what you can charge. Well, it wasn't just charging what people, when you make a phone call. A branch of AT&T, as it was known then, not the same company as today, was Western Electric. Western Electric made the equipment. Bell Laboratories did the R&D. They gave the R&D to Western Electric. Western Electric sold the equipment, and if you had an AT&T line, you had to have Western Electric equipment. You couldn't use anything else. Why Bell Laboratories had a sweetheart deal? Well, AT&T was allowed to charge rates based upon its costs. Bell Laboratories was a cost. So if they spent more on Bell Labs, they could charge more. And in some sense, it cost them nothing. It's important to understand how industries that are regulated or not function. That all came to an end with Judge Green's decision that broke up Bell Labs. And I point out that you can't, when you look at science and technology policy, don't forget the judiciary. It can have a major impact, and in this case, a huge one. Transformed not only Bell Labs, transformed the way we look at industry, industrial research, and it's a unique story.
Let's move closer to today, or at least recent history, political history, and science policy. You already alluded to something, and we'll maybe come back to, the last 2 years. But certainly one reads often in the media today, although some of the administration might say it's the fake media that they read this, that there is a certain Republican hostility to science. But you paint a history very effectively here that is very different from that, and with the major contributions of Hoover and Eisenhower, Gerald Ford, and both Bushes.
Yeah, it's true. And I knew before I started writing the book, I certainly knew about Eisenhower, and that's another story, how Dwight Eisenhower became president, which is a fascinating thing told me by Herb Brownell's grandson, incidentally. Brownell was Eisenhower's Secretary of the Treasury. But I knew about a number of them. I did not know about Hoover. If you go back into the archives and you look at Hoover's writings and his speeches, in 1926, he made a plea. He was not yet president. He made a plea for more money to be allocated, not just to research, but to basic research. And in fact, he knew that he was going to run into trouble simply getting money, government money, so he tried to get industry to contribute to a fund which would then, major fund to basically help basic research. And God knows what would have happened if we hadn't had a depression, whether he would have succeeded, hard to tell. But he was out there very early, so that's one example. Eisenhower is not given the credit, I believe, that is due for what he did for supporting science. And incidentally, if he hadn't been elected, we would have had one of two people. It would have either been Robert Taft, or it would have been Douglas MacArthur. And I think you can probably guess where science stacked up with either one of them. And so, in fact, Eisenhower was a critical cog in the history of this. Gerald Ford I mentioned because he basically put the science policy apparatus back together after Richard Nixon had destroyed it. And then George H.W. Bush and his science advisor, Alan Bromley, really created what we have today in the policy apparatus. It dates back to the George H.W. Bush administration, and in particular the work that Alan Bromley did, which I think is oftentimes overlooked.
Well, let's go just now 1 decade ago, almost exactly, in a Democratic administration. Tell us a little bit about the major science stimulus and the roles played by now Speaker Pelosi and President Obama.
Well, this is one I was personally involved with. After President Obama was elected, you remember, this was 2008, the election, 2009. We had a terrible financial crisis. A lot of people thought that the entire world finance system would come to an end. And I got a phone call shortly after the election from a fellow by the name of Don Lamb, who's a very, very well-known astrophysicist, but also very interested in policy. He had actually worked on the Obama campaign. And Don called me and he said, I think we have an opportunity to do something for science. What would you think about a science stimulus? I said, well, Alan Bromley and I actually tried that back in 2001. We had a mini recession. We didn't succeed, but we didn't have the ear of the president. And Don said, well, I think we might be able to get it. So a small group of us got together. It was Don, Mike Telson, who had been the CFO for the Department of Energy in the Clinton years, and then a couple of others who joined in this, and Tom Khalil, who wound up being in the deputy, do you have to have it right? He was deputy director of OSTP under Obama. And so we got together and we started writing up a list. We were told, if you can make the case for projects that are shovel ready, we can get some money. And so we started, and we came up with $1.5 billion. And that $1.5 billion grew as the ground rules changed, first to 3.5, then up to $5 billion. And, but we didn't know whether there'd be any congressional buy-in. We learned that Nancy Pelosi was out basically trying to make the case for more support for science. She did that with Rush Holt and Anna Eshoo, for example. Anna from California, Rush is, you know, from New Jersey. And I happened to be at my friend Rosa DeLauro's house, and Elliot knows Rosa, and some of you, and Ruth certainly does. I was talking to Anna, and Nancy Pelosi walked in. And she came over and she said, Michael, what are you talking about? And I told her what was going on. And she said, well, how much money do you have in your list of projects? I said, $5 billion. She said, why 5? I said, well, that's sort of what we were, the guidelines. She said, why don't you make it 10? I'll get it done. This was on a Wednesday. And I said, okay. When do you need this? She said, Friday, close of business. So back we went, pulled a few all-nighters, got the list up to $10 billion. Now, we did not do NIH. We knew that there was other support for that. And so we steered clear of it. So it passes the House. She got that done. It goes over to the Senate, and they needed 60 votes. And Arlen Specter was the key vote. He was Republican at the time. Very big supporter of NIH. And Specter said, I will sign that bill. I'll put my name on it. I'll vote for it. I'll vote for it if there's an equivalent amount for biomedical research. It's $10 billion, $10 billion. That was a $20 billion stimulus. And it was put together by a handful of us. And that's a serendipitous kind of thing.
Amazing story. The book is mainly about, appropriately, and with a lot of time focused on defense and basic research, World War II, but it's mainly focused on the United States. And you know, the 20th century clearly was America's century in terms of science. You don't really talk about this, but are we losing the leadership today? And you know, whether it's to Europe in some aspects or to China, I mean, if you had a different sort of postscript epilogue about looking globally at science policy, what might you say?
That was a terrific question, Elliot, and the publishers already said this is just the first edition, so second edition might actually cover more of that. The answer is yes. We, you know, you're quite correct. I mean, the post-World War II era was an American era in many respects, whether it was projection of power, whether it was containment of the Soviet Union, but it was also true for science. We were it. That's no longer true for many reasons. One is that other countries have a lot of very smart people, and they are very committed. And you know, it takes decades to recover from the devastation of war, but eventually you get to a point where you commit resources. So that's one reason. The second reason is that I think to some degree we as a nation have lost sight of, number one, what we have accomplished, and even more important, how much there is still to be done that if we don't do, somebody else will. And what we know from polling is that the public today is not comfortable with the notion of competitiveness. It's a fascinating thing. People, when it comes to science, they view science as a global good. And it is. And if you're a scientist, most scientists don't say, oh, I'm an American scientist, I'm an American physicist. I'm a physicist. I work in a global enterprise. Nonetheless, the benefits that accrue tend to accrue to the people who are there first. It's no accident that some of the most prominent companies, tech companies, are in the United States. Yes, we have intellectual property protection. Yes, we have venture capital, but we're also first out of the gate in terms of discovery. We are beginning to lose that. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for science globally? It doesn't matter, I think. But if you're a political leader, yes, it matters a lot.
Why don't we use that as a segue to my last question, and then I'm going to open it up as promised, and we always try to end these things right on time, which we will. And that's talk about this new program at the Aspen Institute, which was your inspiration. You've identified, with Aaron, some key compelling challenge areas. Could you just elaborate on a few of them for the audience about the kinds of things this program will be grappling with and why?
There are quite a number, and this is not an exhaustive list that I came up with.
And add others on your little cards.
Right. But I'll just give you a sense of things that I became very concerned about over a period of years, and certainly something that was driven home to me by the 2016 election, which incidentally I had written a piece in which I suggested that Hillary Clinton was not going to win because I saw that the rise of populism was such a compelling movement. The issue is what was the genesis of that? And yes, immigration had a role to play. But the more I dug into this thing, the more I became convinced that it was not just immigration. People said, it's these NAFTA and other trade pacts and the jobs that disappeared overseas. But what I also saw was that what was on the horizon was something far more insidious, and that is the impact of technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, which will replace many, many jobs, and not only in manufacturing or agriculture, but even Wall Street. And so the question then is, the populist movement we see arising because people lost their jobs and didn't see a future. But the future basically says that issue isn't going to go away even if we do away with global trade. Technology is going to displace workers. That's almost inevitable. There will be new jobs, but they require different skills. What do we do about it? And if we don't deal with that issue, will there be a backlash that says technology is a bad thing and the science that underpins it is the cause? And so it can come back, if you're a scientist, it can come back to bite you. It's a big topic. People have written about, and Aspen actually has a study done on the role of automation and job loss, but it doesn't connect the dots to the populist and possible reaction to technology. So that's one. Second issue that I felt very strongly about when I was going through the performance of Americans on the so-called PISA, every 3 years, internationally, the OECD runs an examination for 15-year-old kids, testament to language, math, and science. And American kids do very poorly in math and science. That's usually attributed to very poor math and science education. But it's a far bigger problem because, in fact, if you look at the socioeconomic data, what you find is that the kids who perform poorly on these exams, irrespective of what country they come from, are the ones who grow up in poverty, in the lowest socioeconomic class. Now, we unfortunately have a very, very high rate of childhood poverty. In good economic times, it's 1 in 5. Bad economic times, 1 in 3. These are kids, if we don't solve the problem, and I don't have a solution, that's part of the issue, which Aspen can delve into. What do we do about this? How do we take these kids who are living in poverty? We can't suddenly make the families rich, but how do you mentor the kids who are growing up that way so that they can succeed in a world in which STEM is increasingly important. So
Well,
those are two major reasons.
And in fact, Aspen, not surprisingly, has done a lot of work in those areas, and we just released a report of a national commission looking at aspects of our educational curricula and methodologies and pedagogy that might address it. And I think I'm right. I think I heard a report on NPR yesterday with a little glimmer of hope. I think the most recent STEM scores for the United States actually just went up a little.
Inched up
A little. All right, let me open it up to questions, please. Do we have microphone runners? We have a couple. So
And if you wouldn't mind identifying who
yeah,
you are,
identify
and if you're with a
yourself
group,
and then
let
a
us
quick
know.
question ending with a question mark.
Yep. Let's go. Come on, this is not a shy group. Right there.
Hi, my name's Adam Shapiro. Among other things, I'm a historian of science, and there's a ton of really rich literature, especially in recent decades, that focus on the history of science, not just in terms of who's doing the science and how they're doing it, but who science is happening to and what is happening to them, either positively or negatively. You mentioned sort of at the beginning that many scientists have an aversion to politics or to combining science and politics, and we've been seeing, I think, a change of that in recent years, especially with a rising generation of scientists. And it seems like part of that is because people are acknowledging more of the complicated and perhaps uneven history of science. So I wanted to get your take on sort of who science is happening to and how those stories fit into the stories that you're telling.
I don't know whether you want me to use a crystal ball or just a snapshot or what, but I'll make a couple of observations. What motivates scientists are two things. Their quest for new information, for new knowledge, discovery. People who are in science are driven by that. But then there's another piece to it, and that is that there's a certain degree of self-interest. You can't accomplish what you want to do unless somebody funds it. That certainly was historically true. It's true today as much as ever before. So when I look at, for example, the March for Science, which took place after the Trump election, I actually participated in one in New York. But what I saw and when I talked to people, they were concerned, when the people I was marching with, was what the Trump administration was going to do to science, how it was going to affect them as scientists. So what I would say in general is that you can't, scientists are no different than any other people. They have their own egos, they have their own interests, and they're going to act on that. That's been true historically, it's true today. So when you ask how science affects people's lives, you can also ask how policies affect scientists. That's the one I answered. Now, how science affects people's lives, there's a long and complicated history about the good and the bad. In fact, if you go back, we were talking about Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower, who was a big supporter of science, was also very much concerned about how science could be misused by either industry or government. And we all remember his comment about the military-industrial complex. But if you look at his writings, it goes much deeper than just that. He was worried a lot. He didn't know what to do about it, but he said, beware. Your science can be misused. It can help people's lives, but it can also damage them.
Thank you.
Yes,
Next question.
right here in the front.
Yeah, okay, Ruth, go ahead.
Here comes the mic.
I'm Kelly Barsanti. I'm a professor in chemical and environmental engineering at
There you go.
Okay, hi. I'm Kelly Barsanti. I'm a professor in chemical and environmental engineering at UC Riverside. And my question is about what you think the hope is for getting science policy activities to be considered meritorious, because that's the other thing, right? We don't get any credit for it. And we can take credit, and we take, like you said, it's a worthwhile enterprise, but if we're not evaluated and it doesn't count, right? So a policy article doesn't count like a journal article. being here doesn't count like going to a conference. And so I'm just curious what you think the outlook and what we can do to help.
Boy. So now I'll put my academic hat on. And, well, I'll also tell you one other thing. I have a lot of, I'm now at CCNY. I've been there for quite a number of years, department chair. But I still have a lot of friends at Yale. And I was speaking to somebody on the faculty there about the book. This is before it came out. And I said, you know, do you think there's any interest in it? He said, I hate to tell you, but in the last decade, we've gone backwards when it comes to policy. He said there is no one that he knew of in the Yale science departments who had very much interest in this. They take it all for granted. That's a big problem. And that's what, if you read the book, you will discover that what we are able to accomplish requires not only brilliant minds and creativity, but it also relies heavily on the development of policies that encourage those two things. So my message to people in universities, in science departments, is you better pay attention, because without the policies in place, you probably will not be able to achieve your dreams. And get active in it, you know, make your views known. In fact, your Riverside, that's with George Brown's district, and years ago, I think Francis Lakey, is he still here? You remember we went out to, that we had a meeting with George and people from Riverside, and try to get the community more active. It's very hard. However, I do know that on my campus, there's a lot more interest now in the policy arena. We have something called the Colin Powell School for Global Leadership. And this is something I think that they are very interested in pursuing. So you just have to talk about it.
Okay, there's a gentleman in the middle there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ramtin Weiss. I'm from the Office of Science and Technology Austria, which is based within the Embassy of Austria. I wanted to touch upon the society and science and society and ask how this new program is looking to kind of break beyond this very well-educated bubble to communities which are afflicted by geographic immobility and other factors.
Maybe both of us can answer this one. I'll just make one comment. Science is a global enterprise, as I said before. And one of the other areas that I am extremely concerned about is the growing national barriers, whether it's in visas, immigration, or trade. These are anathema to people who actually work in science. We share information. And if there are limits on what we can share, and there may be some very good reasons when security is involved, but if there are limits, that is something that can retard the progress in science. So it's something that is of concern I think we need to address. If you want to say something about the international scope of Aspen.
Yeah, well, I'll actually comment on two parts of that. One, that the Aspen Institute is increasingly a global institution, and we have to be in almost all the things we do. But the other kind of bubble that we're very conscious of, and that we are also committed to leaving if we ever were in it, and that is the bubble of elites, the bubble of the highly educated. And most of the programs of the Aspen Institute actually inhabit very different worlds and are focused on reducing the gap that exists now and addressing problems and challenges of inequity and lack of inclusiveness. So we are getting, I think we've actually always been very good at this, despite our name and some of the images associated with Aspen, about working with people in all sectors of society, and particularly probably those left behind, and particularly those perhaps who are now challenged by the notion of science as something unrelated to them and threatening them and perhaps even holding them back. So I think that this program with Michael and Aaron and the team they'll be assembling will be working very, very diligently to make sure that the audiences that we address, we reach, we speak with, we engage are as diverse as possible. And indeed, we hope to have a relationship with the NewsHour and with other media outlets and reach as many people as we can domestically, and then, of course, with our international network as well.
Well, I'll add one more thing to that, Elliot, and that is something I learned about the NewsHour. I always assumed that the NewsHour reached elites. Turns out that's not quite the case. It has a huge following in rural America. And so I think even my, looking at it, I didn't know that. And I think most of us assume that when we see media, Fox is for the non-elites, and the NewsHour, PBS, major networks. That's what the elites. It's not true. So
We have time for one or two more.
One or two quick questions. Why don't we actually ask each of you? Well, you unless there's someone else. Ruth, you're much better at this than I am. But look, why don't we get two questions asked, and then Michael will respond to both.
Ask your questions, and we're going to try and get Michael to answer both at the same time.
I'm Robert Ratner from Georgetown University. It's been over a decade since the IOM report on vaccinations and autism came out, and yet we're still having healthcare providers murdered in Pakistan as they give polio vaccines, and clearly the measles epidemic. I'd like to hear your view of what the policy solution might be moving forward.
A simple question, and the other one equally simple, I expect.
In a way, we are kind of connected. I was going to ask Michael to go back to the issue of facts versus opinions, politics.
And you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Irving Lurch. I'm a retired antiquarian physicist. Therefore, no associations are needed. The question really has to do with the way politicians and certain institutions and the general public view scientists and excuse facts by saying, well, scientists are just an interest group out for their own. They just want public money or they want corporate money. They're fat cats. Their opinions, therefore, are suspect. Their facts are therefore suspect. So how do we deal with that? Because obviously, the measles epidemic is very much a product of that.
well, those are both, I think, extraordinarily important observations. I don't have necessarily a policy prescription, but I will tell you what I think some of it is rooted in. And that is, it's rooted in the arrogance of scientists. Scientists, I'll give you, you mentioned vaccines, but let me mention one other where we see this. The way in which we talk about a major, and in this case, I would say existential issue, and that's climate change. Instead of providing somebody who you talk to who's not a scientist and explaining, and I do this in classes, I teach a major astronomy course, and I devote one part of a lecture to climate change. I teach the kids enough about it in 30 minutes that they could go out and become advocates for doing something about it. They understand it well enough. But what do we do as scientists, and what do we do as policymakers? 98% of scientists say climate change is a critical problem, and it's man-made, anthropogenic. That's not the way to talk to the public. That's like saying, we know something you don't know. Ha ha. You better listen to us. Instead of basically dealing with some of the facts, but on not condescending, but just say, this is in your own interest. Let me spend a few minutes telling you something. You will be able to make your decisions with the information that I'm providing you, and I'll encourage you to talk to others. It's not a policy issue. This is more of it's almost a public relations issue. It's a communications issue. The Alan Alda Institute does a wonderful job in training scientists on how to communicate, but they don't spend the time on what to communicate. And the how to is important, so is the what.
And if I can just end by connecting a dot back to where you began, I think it's also about telling stories.
Yes.
And if you tell stories about climate
Right.
that people can understand, if you tell stories about vaccines and what happens, instead of
You're
just
right.
dictating to
That's right.
people that this is what the experts think and this is what's good for you, trust me,
Yeah.
it's a very different outcome, I
Yeah.
think. Well, let me ask all of you to thank Michael, and I welcome this new wonderful program.